Yeah. So this is part two of what I'm calling the age of the argument, which is itself an argument I've been working on for many years, and I'm now committed to putting to paper. But I find that these talks are a nice way to sort of guide my thinking, help prompt my thinking. So in the first part, I tried to establish what I mean by the age of the argument, and then talked about what an argument is, to sort of summarize as sort of pithily as I can. The basic setup is not that novel, right? It's clear, definitely in my lifetime, that any sort of residue of any sort of master narrative or master source has really vanished. And that now everything, right, from our health to, our beliefs, to our diet, to our genders, are all sort of up for grabs, right? Nothing is just simply a given anymore, right? When I was growing up, my pediatrician, Dr. Schiffer, was everything, right? I mean, you went to him, whatever he said, we did. In retrospect, maybe he didn't always tell us the right things, but the point is we never questioned it. It didn't matter. Now, I question everything, right? If you think about going to get some sort of medical remedy, there are so many different arguments about the best way, from traditional Chinese medicine and homeopathy and Western herbs to diet to Christian Science to Western medicine to naturopaths, and each one of these has its own rationale, right? Has its own argument about what a body is, the relationship between the body and sickness, right? Those things are not given. Right? There's a great book by Georges Canguilhem called The Normal and the Pathological, in which he investigates, right, this sort of discourse around whence disease, right? Is the diseased body, a sick body, is that different than its continuous state? Is it inherent to its state? There's no right answer, right? Each sort of medical practice puts forth a model of the body, how we know it, how it exists in the world, what disease is, and what counts as remedy. None of them are false per se, right? I know people might bash homeopathy, but it's making an argument, right? And you might not find it compelling. But that doesn't annul its claims to truth, its claims to an argument. It claims to saying, yes, this is a way to go. An argument is not premised on proof, right? And I know in the sort of, college courses, right, you always think, if you're giving an argument, what's your proof? But proof is the end of an argument, right? Proof is, there's no need to argue because it's just true. Look, it's self-evident. That's what proof is. It's self-evidence, right? There's nothing to really argue about. Argument begins where proof leaves off. And that's a paraphrasing of Chaim Perelman. Wrote this book here called The New Rhetoric. That's what we rhetoricians have always believed, right? That an argument is the sort of, it's not a grounded thing. It takes evidence, not proof, evidence. It takes data points, and a variety of data points. And it already assumes what counts as a data point. And then it puts these things together in a set of relationships, a little engine, a little machine that's not grounded. But this little set of relationships floating through the air, these little data points are sort of sliced out of the world, sort of come together and they create this. They create something called sense. And you either think of that and you go, oh, that makes sense, or you look, yeah, that's nonsense, right? I don't believe that. But that is what all arguments do, right? Arguments are not grounded, right? By definition, that is not what they are. They have evidence. They don't have proof. And this has never been made more apparent than by our current, pandemic, right? And there are even people say there isn't a pandemic, that the pandemic is in fact propagated by the media. And that's an argument too. And when this thing, again, first started, I'm a sort of know-it-all guy, and I thought I'd read all the reports, and I could figure out what was actually happening. And what became very quickly apparent is there will be no certainty, right? That each paper I'd read, this one from this school in China, or this one in England, or this one in Sweden, or these different studies out of various American universities, they put together various data points. And they inevitably have to leave out some, right? Because an argument is not exhaustive. Right? There is no such thing as an argument that accounts for everything, right? One way to think about that is, with the old sort of image of chaos theory, right? In which a butterfly flaps its wings in New Zealand, and I break up with a girlfriend, right? Everything is so interconnected. There's so many factors, and if you include factors and their relationships, it's infinite. So no argument is ever going to be exhaustive. It's never going to be definitive, right? It's always putting forth a position, and that position is inherently, in a sense, precarious because it's not grounded, right? It can always be sort of disrupted by a new data point. And again, thinking about Corona and COVID, you'd read some study, and I'd think, oh, that makes sense. And then someone would say, well, sure, but in China, more people smoke, and they didn't take into consideration that, so whatever they learned there doesn't apply to, let's say, the United States. Or in Italy, families live together very close, and that's different than America, so it doesn't apply here. There'll always be another variable. There'll always be another variable. And so the age of the argument is, again, that's what we're living in, right? Where everything, our health, how we come to know anything, is up for grabs. We go shopping online for arguments about what to eat, arguments about what to believe about this COVID, about whether to wear a mask, not wear a mask, what kind of mask, what masks do. There are ethical arguments. There are, medical arguments. There are arguments of physics and the speed of saliva. All these things, again, are assembled and put forth. We digest it, and then we do something. But we do that thing not based on certainty, right? Arguments will never allow for certainty. But neither are they uncertain, right? It's not like certainty is not lacking from arguments, right? Precisely because there will never have been certainty. Certainty is impossible, right? Because there's no ground, because there's no proof. So that means, certainty is exiled, but we still have to make decisions. In fact, we still do make decisions. We still decide what to do based on sort of an impossible calculus of factors. And so that's what I want to talk about here. I want us to come to this sort of understanding. I want to see the sort of field I'm constructing, right, that I'm calling the age of the argument, in which there's no clear master voice, right? We don't trust the government. We don't trust the newspapers. You might trust this newspaper, but not that one. And all kinds of arguments about it. I don't believe Fox News. Don't believe the New York Times. Don't believe mainstream media. The red herring that's been sent up in our time, in this contemporary moment, is this thing called fake news. But the very idea of fake news, which may be a certain kind of problem, I'm not ruling that out, but it's still a red herring because it's not a defining characteristic of our age. There will always be falsity, right? Falsity is, that's nothing new. What's new is the dissemination, or the sort of proliferation, the pervasion of a world in which there are many arguments about the same thing, all of which are true, and some of those truths, some of those arguments will be mutually exclusive. Not necessarily. You might be able to believe this and that. So it's not a question of fake news, fake versus true, right? And you can see, the ads for the New York Times is really trying to maintain that it's true, right? It's doubling down on a truth position, a certainty position. But that just shows how aged they are, right? How anachronistic. Because that's not the age we're living in. We're living in an age in which certainty per se is exiled. And so as individuals and as a society, but let's just talk about the individual, you have to make decisions. You do make decisions. And those decisions are not based on certainty, not based on proof, right? So how do we do that? How do we make decisions when not only am I not sure what's true, but I will never be sure, and nor will anybody else. Again, this COVID thing has shown that, right? No one, these scientists in their labs, are trying to break down all the factors and the DNA sequencing and, studying all these sort of statistical figures, but there's still no answer. There's still no certainty, right? Science doesn't yield any more certainty than fiction, right? So it's no longer a question of truth versus untruth, of fake news versus real news. It's a question of multiple truths, and then what do you do? That is sort of the challenge. And again, I come from, I have a PhD in rhetoric. I consider myself a rhetorician or a sophist, and I know that has a sort of pejorative connotation, but, we always believe this, right? That's how rhetoric kind of got a bad name. The philosophy was a thing that proffered truth, and rhetoric was the thing that never really considered truth, right? Truth is just a move within an argument, but there is no inherent truth. Everything is about these arguments, these sort of, and the very strange logic of the assemblage of an argument, and then it's the possibility of it being compelling, how it compels. And that's, again, always been true for certain people, such as myself. But what's changed is that now what was the sort of fringe, weird thing I used to believe is now the conditions. There's the avowed, obvious conditions of public discourse, right? Down to public policy and how we treat a potentially fatal, virus, right? We don't make these decisions on certainty, right? We make them based on arguments, on evidence, and the relationship between those data points. So what do you do? What do you do? How do you make decisions? Well, the fact of the matter is we're always making decisions without certainty. To me, a really obvious example is, in romance and sex. And what do you do? When do you lean in for that kiss, right? In the beginning of a relationship. When do you make that next move? How do you know? It's never certain, right? And we talk about consent, and consent is, of course, important. But, of course, consent doesn't eliminate this other field of uncertainty, right, in which we make decisions. So, maybe you ask before you go in for a smooch, right? But for many of us, we've leaned in for a smooch based on other kinds of evidence, other moments. Something seems compelling, and sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, but in either way, it's a thing. But let's take away, remove the sort of, complexity of that first kiss and talk about you're with your lover, you're with a longtime lover, and you're having sex. And what do you do? At what point do you stop this and go for that? What point do you kiss an ear and then a neck, then a mouth? How do we make those decisions? We make them all the time, of course, right? I mean, you don't stop and look for proof, right? You making a decision based on all kinds of information that's coming into you that you're processing, that's not strictly rational, right? It's not completely irrational, right? It's not without rationality, without some kind of, deductive reasoning. She's done this in the past, she's doing it now, right? That's logic, right? Therefore, I believe this is what she wants and I'm going to do. But that's just one data point, right? One stream, one possible set of relationships between data points. There are others, right? And it's really a complex calculus, right? And it's quite nebulous, and yet we do it all the time. We do it all the time. In rhetoric, there's this figure of kairos. Kairos is the propitious moment It's the moment in which you act. It's the moment in which you lean in for that kiss. It's the moment at which you change sex positions. It's the moment in which you act. And when's Kairos, right? It doesn't, it itself is just this emergent thing. It's fleeting and it's temporal, and it emerges from a kind of interplay of bodies and moods and history and time of day, and so many factors sort of conspire, and they create a this, now. You know, for me, whenever I think about Kairos and I want to explain it, I think about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the gunfight, you know, and the three faces are all looking at each other, right? And Sergio Leone closes in on each face, and you see their eyes moving. What's that moment you draw? What's that moment you draw? Right? That's Kairos, right? You see an opportunity, you see a moment that sort of emerges, that comes between all these factors and announces itself. But your action, the moment you seize it is the moment of Kairos in a sense, right? It's not like, oh, there's Kairos and then you act, because you might very well miss it, right? Kairos is fleeting. To the Greco-Romans, Kairos was, might only come once, twice in your life, right? In modern rhetoric, for people like me and Chaim Perelman, Kairos, the propitious moment, is every decision, right? At every juncture, we are making decisions based on this sort of impossible calculus of factors that yield these sort of emergent moments. So sex to me is a really clear, familiar way of thinking about it. Food is another. Right? So you can think about how we make decisions about food. Often, especially in today's culture, people go online and they read things and they say, oh, this person reads you should eat kale. Kale's really good for you. Someone else says, no, you shouldn't eat kale, or if you eat kale, it needs to be steamed. And then people construct these elaborate diets. And these diets are premised on all kinds of logic. Those diets and those claims about kale steamed or raw or paleo diet or a gluten-free diet, all those things, they are arguments. They put together evidence, various data points, and created a relationship between them. But none of them are certain. None of them are true per se, although they're also true. Right? It's not that they're not true. They're also true. And of course, they're often conflicting with each other. So how do you decide? Many people, of course, rely on, a blog, rely on something they read. When I was growing up in my house, I remember, we always had the New York Times delivered to our house, nice New York liberal Jewish family. And, I think it was Tuesdays had a section, the Science Times, and there was always an article by Jane Brody on food and health. And whatever Jane Brody said, my mom all of a sudden was starting to cook, so we'd have tons of broccoli for a while, and then there'd be another article a year later that said, no, too much broccoli leads to colon cancer, and all of a sudden broccoli would disappear. So my mother liked to be tethered to this external factor, right, the input of Jane Brody. And that speaks to an earlier age when we did that, right, when we more readily relied on sources that we took just to be true, sort of unquestioned, right? And that was what the New York Times was. It was even called the paper of record. The paper of record, right? It's hilarious. No, don't think anybody refers to it as such anymore, right? It is a paper of a record. But no doubt many people do that, right? When there's no clear certainty, when you don't know what to do, people like to grasp. They like to go to an external thing, right? They like to rely on something else to help ground their own decisions, right? And in a way, that's a kind of will, and it's going to sound dramatic, a kind of will to fascism, a will to subjugate your own will to some external term. In the introduction to Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, Foucault calls that book The Guide to Anti-Fascist Living. And he talks about that the greatest threat, in a way, to your freedom is your inner fascist, is your willingness to sort of subjugate yourself to these other forces. Right? So I want to suggest that when we're making decisions, let's say about food, sure, there's other outside information. We hear things, we do things, right? Kale is a great example. There was a restaurant here in San Francisco called Cafe Gratitude. It was all raw, and people used to mock Cafe Gratitude, because all the names of the dishes were, I am grateful, I am honored, I am whatever, and I kind of loved it, right? Because it really disrupted how you think about food. It really created a relationship between you and your food other than pure consumption, and I really liked that. And there was a period in my existence where that raw food was doing it for me. I would eat it and feel just great, right? I would shit well, I feel good, I felt clean, I felt alive, it was vital. Right? And then one day, after about 6 months of eating there with alarming frequency, I was like, oh my God, if I eat another bowl of this raw kale, I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die. My body just didn't want it anymore. Right? The criterion of assessment then was really my health, my vitality. And that's the whole thrust of Nietzsche's philosophy, right? That we are these bodies, and we can train them, and they are trained in various ways to reach for certain things. And some people, what Nietzsche would call the sort of ill-constituted, are the people who instinctively grab for the things that make them sick. Right? We know lots of people like this. I mean, that's what we might call an addict or an alcoholic. You can see someone sort of deteriorating, but they still go for that drink. Or, I've been watching The Wire again recently with my son, and if you haven't seen it, there's a sergeant in the homicide division, Jay Landsman, and he's always eating some grotesque thing, a big cheesesteak, and next to him always, it's sort of a throwaway, it's never talked about, is a bottle of Pepto-Bismol, right? So he's making decisions, and he's eating certain food that is giving him certain satisfaction, but it's also hurting him. So he knows that, but he's not going to change his ways, right? So he offsets it with another thing, right? The Pepto-Bismol. But for Nietzsche, the strong man, right? The well-turned out man. Let's not call him strong. That's his phrase in Ecce Homo. Nietzsche says, how do we recognize a well-turned out man? And the well-turned out man is the one who instinctively chooses the very things he desires are the very things that fuel his health, that fuel his vitality. And I want to suggest that that is the criteria for decision making. In the absence of truth, right? We really live in this age of the argument in which there's this massive proliferation, an endless proliferation of positions and new positions and possibilities. And they're all true, right? They all have a claim to truth, right? So all are true and none are true. And if that's not our criteria of assessment, if it's not like I'm going to choose that one versus that one because that one's true and that one's not, how do you choose? You choose the thing that serves your health, that serves your vitality. Not because Jane Brody wrote about it in the Science Times, right? But because your body experienced it. Because you know how you feel. You know how you shit. You know how you sleep. Right? So in the absence of certainty, right? We can go looking for certainty, right? But all that does is create an endless deferral and a kind of madness, right? Because it will never come. Right? Certainty is exiled, right? We live in times, but we live in a life in which everything's always changing, in which there will never be certainty precisely because there will never be an exhaustion of data. There will never be some claim that is just absolutely true across all time and place for all people that's utterly exhaustive. That just doesn't exist, right? And you could say, well, it does, and you double down on that. That's fine, right? But that doesn't change the fact that we live in a time of the argument in which if you believe that there is such thing as certainty, you need to make that argument, right? So it doesn't change the conditions. And I want to suggest that in the absence of searching for truth, rather than doubling down and trying to seek that thing that will just give you proof that that's the right thing to do, that you're sort of thrown back on yourself. And you can choose the thing that just gives you pleasure. I want to talk about pleasure. Sort of immediate gratification, like the character in The Wire who eats these enormous grotesque sandwiches and then clearly doesn't feel well, and he's a rather obese man. But the Pepto-Bismol lets you know that whatever he's eating, it's not serving him, right? It's not a well-honed system he's got going on. So if you choose your own health and vitality, sort of thrown back on yourself, you don't have an external factor anymore. Right? There's nothing outside you can ground yourself on, right? And that can provide a sort of firm ground, right? A firm podium, right? Ralph Waldo Emerson says, gladly we would anchor. Gladly we would anchor, right? It'd be great if we could just know this thing is true. I'm anchored here, and it's from here I can make positions, right? And here I can be certain that what I'm doing is right. Emerson says, gladly we would anchor, but the anchorage is quicksand. Right? Everything gives way. Everything's in flux. Right? That kale and that raw food was great for me for a few months. And then it wasn't. Why? Because my needs change. My body changes. Right? We are always in flux. Things I believed one day, I don't believe another day. Right? Why? Not because I now believe something else is true, but because the thing that serves my health and vitality has changed, right? I am a different body. I'm a 50-year-old body, not a 16-year-old body. We eat differently. We should be eating differently. And of course, it's endlessly confusing because you really double down. You're like, yeah, this meal is the thing that's great for me. And then all of a sudden it's not, because everything is in flux. And without these external terms, right? Without a firm ground on which to make decisions, we are thrown back on ourselves. And what it means to be yourself is to be a body and, for lack of a better word, a spirit. To be a body is to be both visible and invisible, to be a whole metabolic engine that itself is changing, right? And that the things you need to bring into that body change because your ability to process it changes. Right? And the things you might want from that processing change. Right? When I was young, I could eat anything and everything, and it didn't really matter. It didn't really matter. I had certain things I didn't want to eat, but nothing really messed up my way of going. Right? And that's true generally of youth. It's very, it's voracious and very, it's not such a sensitive body, right? As you get older, yeah, I'm a little sensitive these days, right? Certain things will make me feel shitty, right? Make me feel shitty sometimes for days. And that's just a fact. But what that means is, again, I'm thrown back on myself and into a kind of feedback loop, right? In which I'm taking in information, right? And I'm taking in data itself from what I'm eating. I'm trying things, and I go by my taste, and I go by how I feel later that day and the next day, and I look at my shit, and it becomes a whole again, a kind of calculus, right, of factors in which I am constantly assessing. Does this serve my health? Does this serve my vitality? And I want to suggest that there's a way in which this is pleasurable. It really sounds like work, right? But for Nietzsche and for me, and of course Nietzsche was a rhetorician, right? That's what he taught, rhetoric. He was really a rhetorician more than a sophist, right? Because he was a rhetorician more than a philosopher. He really was a sophist, not a philosopher, because he's the one who exiles truth as the driving force of philosophy, right? And he's the one who introduces these other criteria, right? As a quick aside, Nietzsche says the great questions of philosophy. The great questions of philosophy are not what is truth, what is mind, what is language, what is spirit, what are ethics. The great questions of philosophy for Nietzsche are, where do you live, what do you eat, and how do you recreate, right? He threw back all our decision making onto ourselves as individuals, as these little engines who are constantly processing the world. And each engine is a little different, right? So kale might be great for you. It might be great for you. But it doesn't mean kale is good for everybody. Right? So it's hilarious to read an article that says, eat kale, you should eat kale. Turns out I shouldn't eat kale. It really messes me up. Right? Kale is not good for me. And that's true kind of all things. And I want to, again, suggest that, this seeking of health and vitality is itself pleasure. It's not asceticism. It's not a kind of controlling neuroses, right? Because I could see it becoming that, right? And that's definitely, it's definitely sometimes been the case with myself. We definitely see it in our culture, this sort of neuroses around what's good for us. But I want to come back to what Nietzsche says about the well-turned-out man. He's the one who instinctively chooses. The very thing he desires is the thing that's good for him. And that takes a kind of training to train your instincts, right? To choose the things that serve you. So rather than it being a neuroses, it becomes a well-tuned body from the inside out rather than the outside in. Right? So the neuroses of decision-making come where you're placing yourself between yourself and some external factors. Well, I read that gluten isn't good, maybe I shouldn't have gluten, right? I myself, it was suggested to me by my traditional Chinese medical doctor. And I find TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, really compelling, right? Because I like the story it tells, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's also helped me, right? It served my vitality, it served my health. But my doctor suggested cutting out gluten and dairy. I was having chronic sinus issues, and I did. And the fact is, it didn't really affect my sinuses at all when I cut them out. But it dramatically changed how I shit. And shitting, of course, is such a crucial moment within our metabolic system, right? It's how we're processing, right? And it's a great means of assessment, right? Nietzsche talks a lot about it, digestion and shitting. And of course, the Germans are quite fixated on it, but there's a good reason, right? Shitting's, of course, one thing. You can also look at people's faces, right? I haven't seen someone in a long time. You kind of look them over and you're like, oh, you're looking pretty good. Whatever you're doing is working because you look good. You have a glow. Sometimes you see someone and you're like, oh, whatever they're doing isn't working, right? And the world shows itself. That's a great lesson from Nietzsche, right? So it's not some hidden truth you need to find. It's really right here and now. Do you feel good? Do you feel good? Again, rather than seeking truth, I want to say that our decisions should seek a kind of pleasure, right? But that pleasure is not the pleasure of consumers' capitalism, right? It's not Herbert Marcuse in a book called Eros and Civilization says, capitalism co-opted the pleasure principle. So that we somehow capitalism, I'm calling capitalism whatever we have here in America, which of course isn't really capitalism, right? It's state-sponsored corporatism or something. But it's somehow led us to believe that it's the thing that provides pleasure. And by pleasure, we mean a new cool thing, a new car, right? I know many people, and I've not been immune to this, who, when they feel sort of shitty, they buy something online. I know a lot of people like that, right? It's their road to pleasure. But I want to say that that's not what I mean by pleasure, right? And so I've often said, well, I'll let capitalism and I'll let contemporary American whatever culture, consumerism, this is called consumerism, own pleasure. You guys can have pleasure. Maybe instead I want to proffer enjoyment. Because enjoyment is a process of living through, right? It's not just a reactive state to something. To enjoy something is a kind of action by a body. Right? Enjoyment is thorough. I would say enjoyment's often slow, and it's one reason, the demands of our overlords, our corporate bosses, they don't want you to enjoy yourself. They want you to have pleasure, right? That's why they created the 2-minute, Pornhub clip, right? So rather than going and making sweet, long, decadent love in the morning, your alarm is set at 7, you get up, and when you need your pleasure, you can sit on your phone, click on that little 2-minute clip. You're still plugged into the machine. You're still plugged into the screen. You're still looking at ads. Right? Our work world, in America, does not foster enjoyment, right? In fact, it seeks to systematically eradicate enjoyment by shoving pleasure in our faces, right? No, doesn't this feel good? Doesn't that feel good? Don't you like that clip? Don't you want to just take your weekend break? Don't you want to buy this? Don't you want to buy that? And I'm not saying those things don't offer some pleasure, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying there's a decision making premised on enjoyment, and that when your enjoyment is aligned, right, with your health and vitality, you become this great adjudicator, right, of information. You become a great decision maker. So I want to suggest that just as we, make decisions about the rhythm of our sex, just as we make decisions about what to eat and what we want, and you can see all the factors that come into place, from things you crave, what's immediate, also your knowledge of your history of how eating that thing in the past and how you'll feel today, tomorrow, right? It's a play, and then there's price, and then there's difficulty of cooking, and that is in fact how we make decisions about anything and everything. Right? Think about music. Think about movies, right? In a sense, both of those things, let's say a movie is an assemblage of data points, right? They take various things. A film doesn't show everything in the world. Even Terrence Malick's Tree of Life, which tried to, it came close, still leaves out things, right? No film is totally exhaustive, right? Even, Battle of Potemkin, right? No film is exhaustive, right? It's a slice of the world. It's an assemblage of points. And then the film itself creates relationships between all those points. So a film is an argument, right? It's the same logic as an argument about COVID. Same logic as an argument about kale, right? Or about medicine. It's taking, the machinery is the same. The architecture is the same. When we make decisions all the time about which movies we like, we don't like, whether we find that movie compelling or not, right? And we know it's not grounded in truth and certainty, right? We just say, yeah, that movie did it for me, right? And you can begin to figure out why and how a certain movie stirs you, why you're attracted to it, why it's something you take in, you say, yes, this I like, right? We know it's not premised on certainty. You might develop, a rationale and a sort of your own rule set, if you will, but that doesn't make it certain, right? And yet you still will come out boldly and say, I like this film, I don't like this film. Same with music, right? Music is, again, an assemblage of all kinds of things, right? The history of music is taking this piece and not that piece. Certain resonances, tone, timbre, rhythm, intensity, lyrics, right? Styles, our associations with genres and moods. And how do you say, I like that song, I don't like that song? That song does it for me, and that one does. And it's a kind of resonance, right? It works with you and your body. It serves your health and vitality. It's something you can enjoy. I want to say that's no different when we're making decisions about our politics or about COVID, how we deal with it, how we make our decisions to wear a mask, not wear a mask, right? I understand the people who don't want to wear a mask. I understand the people who don't trust the media, who think a type. I understand them. They're not wrong, What gets weird to me are the people who act as if they're certain, right? The people who are so certain that this virus is not a threat that they cough on your face because you're wearing a mask. How bizarre is that? And at the other point, the other side, the people who see someone walk down the street without a mask and they call the police. Both are madness to me, right? What I want to suggest is I keep saying I want to suggest it. I just want to say it, ma'am, that once we remove certainty and the will to certainty, right? Once we take it out of the equation, right? It's never going to be a question of proximity to certainty. We're never going to get closer or further away from it, right? It's just simply not a factor. In Age of the Argument, it is certain, right? It's not uncertain. It is certain, right? Once we remove that, how do we stand towards our decisions? If we say that there's multiple truths at any given point, right? And that we are thrown back on ourselves as individuals to make sense, to make decisions, to believe this or that, to do this or that, to wear a mask, not wear a mask, to decide you want to go back to work, you don't want to go back to work. If we know, if we believe, if we accept that those decisions will never be premised on certainty, then how do we stand towards them, and how do we stand towards other people's decisions? Right? So I want to say that, we live in this age of the argument, right, in which there are certain conditions, in which certainty is exiled, in which there's this proliferation of assembled positions that we're thrown back on ourselves in this sort of feedback loop of decision making, right, in which we're constantly reckoning kairos, this emergent moment, through the elusive and always particular criteria of health and vitality, the things that serve us, right? And I'll talk in a minute about why that's not just a selfish thing, right? We live in this age of the argument. We're thrown back on ourselves. We have this metabolic trajectory. Then how do we stand towards the things we've decided? And how do we stand towards someone else having made their decision, right? One thing that it always surprises me on the Twitter, and I love the Twitter, and at some point I'll talk about why I love Twitter so much as a medium, as a form. The experience can be disgusting, but as a quick aside, you can control that. I don't understand when people find it so bile-filled. Just don't follow that person, right? That part I don't understand, right? That's what I like about Twitter is I control my feed. I only see things I want to see. And I also like this sort of avant-garde proffering of these limits, right? Anyone who's into the sort of French Oulipo school of Raymond Queneau and Georges Perec, who like to give themselves rules before they constructed something, right? So Perec wrote a novel without the letter E. There's the letter E, there's nowhere in it. It's not because he left it out typographically. It's because he found words that don't have the letter E to write his novel. So I like Twitter for that fact. But one thing that's really conspicuous on Twitter, and the thing people really talk about, is this sort of cultural disaster, right, of bile. And one thing that, again, pops to me is people are so certain, right? And they're so willing to denigrate somebody else because they are so certain. Right? But all you have to do is look at a Twitter feed, right, to realize it is this sort of, it's a veritable cubism, right? It's all these different positions coming from all these different angles, from all these different perspectives. That's so obvious. So at what point do you say, no, not that, right? And you're awful and you're wrong, and in fact, people get death threats in their direct messages on Twitter. I mean, it's madness. I want to say if we're living in this age in which there will never have been certainty, in which the question of pure fabrication is moot. It's a question of the assemblage of components into a position, into an argument that you find compelling or not based on a whole series of factors that are individual to you. Then the relationship to your position should not be one of bile-filled adamants. Right? Doesn't mean you need to be wishy-washy. But it does suggest that there's this other relationship to the things we say and the things we believe that I want to say is fundamentally ironic, right? Because we believe it and we don't believe it. Right? That's what irony is. That's what, coming out of Socrates, right? And Plato's Socrates was the great inventor of irony. And what, Socratic irony is, it's the putting forth of a position and the immediate rejection of that position precisely because it will never be certain, right? That's Socrates. Socrates doesn't know anything. That's what he says. He's the wisest man because he doesn't know anything, right? I'm not making that up. That's Socratic, Plato's Socrates, at least. There are other Socrates, right? So what Socrates does is he says things, but then in the very saying of them, he's rejecting them, or he's rejecting the possibility of it, because for him, there's this divinity, this sort of sublime divinity that will deny the possibility of your all too mortal certainty. Right? And so he's always speaking in this double voice. I want to say that I think that is a model for how to stand towards our positions, our own positions, and the positions of others. I want to suggest that irony becomes the grounds of an ethics, right? An ethics of how we relate to each other and how we relate to our positions. That somehow in this sort of massive splintering of positions that is really accelerated in the last 20 years with the internet and obviously post-Watergate and the displacement of centralized media and the sort of absolute frayed trust in any government, or any newspaper or any scientific study, because we know it's all funded, right? The great inheritance from Marxism, right? Follow the money. And any scientific paper usually can trace back to some big pharma company, right? That's trying to corner the market on something or trying to drive up its revenue. Once we know that's the case, with all this great splintering, what's happened is people are doubling down on their adamance. And that's why people have this sort of view of Twitter as this sort of horrible place, because people are so terrible to each other, right? Because they're all so certain. And yet the very existence of Twitter, the very grounds, the very possibility of them being able to participate in such a venue is that there is no certainty, there is no truth, there is no proof. All there are positions. And if that's the case, if all there are positions, then how can you be so certain that you're going to call the cops on that person? How can you be so certain that you're going to cough in somebody's face? How can you be so certain that you're going to make death threats against somebody else? Right? There is this other way of standing towards the things we believe. And I want to be clear that that doesn't eliminate passion, right? It doesn't eliminate your own personal certainty about the things that are good for you. What it does is eliminate certainty as a universal. Of creating a ground of the earth on which everybody can stand. What you do is you build a ground for yourself that's temporary. You anchor, but it's quicksand, and that's okay. You move on to the next thing. You keep moving, right? And so you can be passionate without being certain. And this is hugely important to me. I grew up in a small town outside New York, and it was something we all did in this little town. We'd be eating something. Oh my God, these French fries are the best thing I've ever had. The next day you're eating pizza. This is the best thing I've ever had. And people make fun of me all the time because I'll talk about a song. I'm like, oh, this is the greatest song ever. And then 2 days later, it's a different song. This is the greatest song ever. And I'm like, well, I thought you said that other one was. And I was confused by that because for me, when I say this is the greatest song ever, these French fries are the greatest food ever, it's an ever from this particular moment, right? But that ever is going to keep changing, right? It's going to change because my horizon changes 2 days later, or an hour later, or a week later, right? So when I make these pronouncements, right? I make these pronouncements, and I've been mocked about it my whole life. Nietzsche's Genealogy is the greatest book ever, right? And then I'll say Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling is the greatest book ever. Like, well, which one is it? They're both the greatest book ever. Depends what I want at that particular moment from this or that, from saying that, from uttering that, from that that sort of confluence of factors, that calculus of elements that come out and I say, yeah, that's the greatest book ever. Right? I don't have to make a definitive list once and for all. Right? And in fact, it's an absurdity. Why? Because there's nothing certain. Things keep changing. Things are always in flux. What I used to love, I might not love anymore. Right? That's not a bad thing. You know, our culture still has this funny thing where it's a common theme in movies and how we make sense of our public figures is, somebody's principled. Bernie Sanders, at least he's principled, which might or might not be true. But I want to say that being principled in the world I'm giving you, in the world I'm putting forth here, in this age of the argument, being principled is really just to be a sort of quiet fascist, right? To create a set of factors, criteria that are external to you, to which you're going to tether yourself despite the flux of your body, despite the flux of the world, despite the massive proliferation of individual perspectives and their own metabolic propensities and needs and the things that serve different bodies at different times. It's always different, right? So why be principled? Why be principled, right? If you're going to be principled, there are principles that are more forgiving, right? That are not adamant, that are not fixed in place. So thinking about this ethics of rhetoric, this ethics of irony, I think about a couple things. One, I think about Michel Foucault's History of Sex, Volume 2, The Use of Pleasure. And he looks at how the Greco-Romans sort of adjudicated their desires, what counted as good and bad. And for them, they really relied, and as Foucault talks about explicitly, they relied on this thing called kairos, right? Which meant, it was never universally good or bad to have sex with that boy. Right? It all depends on circumstance. It depends on kairos. It depends on time and place. It doesn't mean nothing is right. It just means that what's right is emergent in that moment. And then he begins to find this moment in which things move over to this Judeo-Christian model of the Ten Commandments, this external set of dicta, right? That command you to act a certain way. Thou shalt, right? In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, Zarathustra replaces the thou shalt with the I will, right? And what that does is fundamentally sort of shift the architecture of how we make assessments. That the ethical then, rather than it being based on some external universal position, right? That then has to apply to everybody equally, becoming a kind of fascism, right? We all have to subjugate our own wills to the will of these laws. We all agree that thou shalt never covet thy neighbor's wife. It's like, sometimes you might want to covet thy neighbor's wife, And this other position comes from the Greco-Romans. It's really an ethics from rhetoric, in which it's not that everything is fair game, right? You can be unseemly, right? You can be grotesque. There were all other modes of assessment of you that didn't call you good or evil, right? And in the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche says, for the Greco-Romans, they had the good and the bad, and the good was what the noble were. It wasn't outside them, right? It wasn't a set of commands that they adhered to, right? They didn't have to get anointed as good by the local priest. They were good because they are good, right? I am that which is good, right? The bad is that which works against me. Right? And then you get Judeo-Christianity, which inaugurates good and evil, right? These sort of universal terms that are ontological. That is good, that is evil. Right? One is fixed in a sort of, again, this universal rule that's external, and the other is endlessly emergent and negotiated as an individual amidst the social. Right? It's not the individual over and against the social. It's the individual vis-a-vis the social and always trying to sort of figure it out, negotiate it, right? Rather than saying, oh, I always know what to do. I always know what to do. I'm never going to covet my neighbor's wife. I'm never going to steal. Yeah, all right. But in a way that's easier. And that's I think, Foucault talks about the inner fascist in his introduction to Anti-Oedipus, that we sometimes want these figures. We want some figure just to be, some ground outside of ourselves. I can point to and go, yes, life's confusing enough. I don't want to constantly be negotiating it. I'm just going to rely on these set of rules. And Nietzsche says that's a world that believes in the herd, that believes in the group rather than the individual. And that the ethics of kairos, the ethics of rhetoric, the ethics in the age of uncertainty are an ethics of the individual enmeshed in the social, right? It's not that I need to do and take control over everything I see and act totally selfishly, right? It's how the things that serve my vitality as a being amongst beings. And it's always emergent, and it's always different, and has shifting criteria. It seems like a lot more work. But I believe that is a less violent ethics, and it's a liberating ethics. One way to think about it is in parenting. When I was growing up, I had friends' parents who had very strict rules. No drinking, be home by midnight. Right? No drinking, no drugs, be home by midnight. In my family, it was, be safe. Don't be stupid. Be safe. Come home at the right time. Right? So I didn't have a curfew. I wasn't prohibited drinking in my house. And those are really the two, I think that really, makes clear kind of the more grandiose things I'm talking about, the Greco-Romans and Judeo-Christianity. But the parent who says, no, it is never good to drink. You always need to be home by 12, right? Regardless of the circumstance, right? A 16-year-old kid is out and, a 16-year-old having a puff of a joint or bong hit or hit an acid or, a drink. It's often a good thing, and that's, again, something I've written about in the past. And at some point I might talk about more vocally, right? That I believe in the psychedelic experience being introduced at a good age. I think it's important. One reason I think it's important is because it creates a different relationship of yourself to the world, right? One in which you're once the center and absolutely not the center. Everything's the center. But think about these two parenting positions, right? One, with my parents saying, be safe, don't be stupid, and be home when you're home. What that does is throw it back on me, right? What counts as not being stupid, right? And of course, if my parents, actually knew many of the things I was doing, they'd be like, whoa, you shouldn't be doing that. But the factors that they usually used, or tried to use to assess was looking at me, my health, my vitality, how I'm doing at school, how happy I am, how I'm operating with the world. Right? It's the same figure I use with my son now, right? I mean, he goes out, he's 16 years old, he's all over San Francisco. I mean, not the present moment, but before this all happened. He's going to do what he's going to do. And rather than poke and prod and limit him, I look at him and I'm like, oh, yeah, he seems happy. Or sometimes he'll all of a sudden not be. He'll be a little grumpy or a little down. And I'm like, oh, I think he's not sleeping enough. I think he's maybe partying too much. And I might say something. And it might not be, don't do those things. But I will prod him to sort of assess how he's feeling vis-a-vis the decisions he's made, right? To try to help him train his own metabolic engine, right? Because it's quite obvious, right? In my house at one point, my parents became concerned about, when I was in high school, about my pot smoking. And I came home one night and I was really high. And my mother was awake. They'd just come back from Europe and was awake by 3 a.m. I knew something was up. I'm so high. And she starts telling me how concerned she was. And she pointed out certain things. She noted that I used to have a poster of Karl Marx on my wall. And now I had a poster of the Grateful Dead. And I was sleeping a whole lot. And it really killed my buzz for a while. I stopped getting high. I got really self-conscious and started paying attention to my own metabolic rhythm and how I was taking in and processing, what my criteria were. But at the same time, I was happy, and I had, fantastic, very loving girlfriend, and I was a lot of friends, and I was writing and thinking good things, and I had all these other signs of vitality. And I had certain signs of shifting things, right? And, changing poster from Karl Marx to the Grateful Dead need not be a sign of sickness, of course, right? And a few years ago, I made my mother apologize to me. I was like, Mom, you killed my buzz. I was doing so great. And all of a sudden, I got super neurotic about my pot smoking. That went away. But my point is, there is this other ethics, right? When there is no certainty, when we don't rely on external universal laws that we base in truth, it yields not every man for himself, not chaos, but quite the opposite. What it yields is a proliferation of decision-making points, right? And introduces a kind of labor on us as individuals to sort of reckon things. But that labor is not a labor kind of forced on us by corporations or by the state. It's the labor of vitality. It's the labor of the work you do to make decisions based on things that serve you well. Yeah. So this is my shtick. This is my argument, right? I want to say that we're living in an age in which the argument is the mode. The argument is the mode of public discourse now, right? It's not just the assertion, it's the argument. And you could say, well, I don't want it to be that way. That doesn't matter. Those are the terms now, right? Nothing has a clear claim to how things are, right? The internet has made that impossible and absurd, right? There's a proliferation of positions, and none of those will ever be certain. So rather than seeking certainty, and rather than creating or importing some external set of laws and rules to guide us, I say we welcome the sort of throwing back on ourselves and the introduction of these sort of feedback loops based on our metabolic propensities and the things that serve us, that make us healthy and vitality. And that in turn begins to yield a kind of ethics of how we stand towards the things we believe and how we stand towards others and their decisions. That's the end.